Every year, millions of people sit down with a fresh spreadsheet, write out a budget, feel genuinely motivated for about 4 days, and then fall completely apart. They call themselves undisciplined. They tell themselves they need more willpower. And then they try the same strategy 12 months later and get the same result. Here is what nobody in personal finance wants to say out loud. Willpower was never going to work. Not for you. Not for anyone. Because the problem was never your character. The problem is your brain. Somewhere between the rise of one-click purchasing and the algorithm designed specifically to keep you scrolling and spending, your dopamine system got quietly hijacked. A hijacked dopamine system does not want to wait for a reward that arrives in 30 years. It wants a reward right now. Every time you resist a purchase, your brain does not register that as discipline. It registers that as pain, not a win, but a loss. That is not a weakness. That is neuroscience. But here is what the science also tells us. The brain is plastic. The wiring can be changed. And in the next few minutes, you are going to learn the exact method to make saving money feel as genuinely addictive as anything the attention economy ever threw at you. To understand the battle you're actually in, you need to understand what dopamine is really for. Most people think of it as the pleasure chemical. That is only half the story. Dopamine is actually the anticipation chemical. It surges not when you receive a reward, but when your brain predicts one is coming. That distinction matters enormously. For most of human history, that anticipation response was useful. It got us out of bed. It motivated us to build, to solve problems. The reward cycle was slow, but the anticipation kept us moving. Then something fundamentally changed. Research published in Advances in Consumer Research in 2025 confirmed what neuroscientists had long suspected. Platforms like TikTok, Amazon, and Instagram deploy personalized ads, scarcity cues, and reward-based systems with one specific goal: to trigger your dopamine system faster and more reliably than your natural environment can. Every scroll is a tiny hit. Every notification is a tiny hit. The purchase confirmation screen, the unboxing, even the anticipation of delivery, all engineered dopamine spikes. And here is what that constant stimulation does to your brain over time. Brands have learned to hijack the reward system, offering micro rewards that keep you engaged, excited, and in many cases addicted. The baseline rises. The reward threshold recalibrates upward, which means the quiet, invisible reward of watching your savings balance grow. Your brain barely registers it at all. This is where a specific kind of thinker becomes essential. Not a financial advisor, not a motivational coach, a behavioral architect, someone who understands that the problem is not information. You already know you should be saving. The problem is design. The behavioral architect's core insight is simple and radical. You do not need more willpower. You need a better environment. Because behavior does not flow from character. It flows from the system surrounding you. Change the system and the behavior changes automatically. The clearest proof of this idea is the video game. Think about how games hold people engaged for hours. They do not lecture you about discipline. They do not ask you to imagine the future. They give you a clear objective, immediate feedback, a visible progress bar, and a small reward at every level. The result is that a person who cannot sit still for 10 minutes will spend 6 hours chasing a digital badge with no material value whatsoever. That is not a weakness. That is dopamine working exactly as designed, and it reveals something important. The activity itself is almost irrelevant. What the brain responds to is the structure of the reward. Gamification, points, badges, and levels tap into variable rewards, making them more enticing by creating anticipation. Which means if you can attach that exact structure to the act of saving money, you do not need discipline at all. But here is the problem nobody has fully solved yet. Knowing this is not the same as doing it. The gap between concept and automatic behavior is where most people disappear. And it comes down to one thing: the loop. In 2012, journalist Charles Duhigg published research that changed behavioral science. He identified a neurological mechanism he called the habit loop, a repeating cycle of cue, routine, and reward that governs virtually every automatic behavior a human performs. 6 years later, James Clear refined that model in Atomic Habits, adding a fourth stage: craving. That addition changed everything. The loop works like this. A cue triggers the brain. The brain generates a craving for the state change it associates with that cue. You execute a response to satisfy the craving. The reward arrives. Dopamine is released. And the loop is encoded slightly deeper into the architecture of the brain. Together, these 4 steps form a neurological feedback loop that ultimately allows you to create automatic habits. Here is the critical part. Your spending habits are already running this loop flawlessly. The cue is boredom, stress, a notification, or a sale alert. The craving is the relief or excitement you have learned to associate with purchasing. The response is the transaction. The reward is the dopamine hit. The loop runs on its own without any conscious input from you. Saving has no such loop. There is no cue, no craving, no immediate reward, which is why it always feels like effort and why budgets always collapse. But what if you could build one? If this is already making sense, subscribe and hit the notification bell. The next part is where this becomes genuinely actionable. Personal finance has a time problem. Every traditional saving strategy asks your present self to sacrifice something real today for a reward arriving in 20 or 30 years. That is not a financial ask. That is a psychological impossibility for a brain wired to prioritize the immediate. Behavioral economists call this hyperbolic discounting. The dual process theory supports this. System 1 thinking, fast and emotional, governs impulse behavior with dopamine, playing a central role in enhancing the appeal of immediate gratification, according to Kahneman's foundational research. The further a reward sits in time, the less value the brain assigns it. Not proportionally less, dramatically less. This is why the standard advice fails. Think about your retirement. Imagine your future self. Visualize financial freedom. These instructions ask your brain to generate emotional arousal around an abstraction that is 30 years away. But dopamine is not actually about pleasure itself. It is about the anticipation of pleasure. Your brain lights up not when you get the reward, but when you expect it. Abstractions 30 years out generate almost no anticipation at all. The shift that changes everything is deceptively simple. Stop trying to make the future feel more real and start manufacturing genuine, immediate pleasure for the right behavior today. The goal is not to delay gratification. The goal is to reattach gratification, to move the reward from the point of spending to the point of saving where it needs to live. The question is, how do you manufacture pleasure on command? That answer has a name. Neuroscientists have understood for decades that dopamine pathways are not fixed. The reward associations in your brain are not hardwired to specific behaviors. They are conditioned responses, and conditioned responses can be reconditioned. The mechanism behind this is called associative learning, and it operates through repetition and proximity. When 2 stimuli consistently appear together, the brain begins to bundle them. It anticipates the second when it detects the first. This is the same process that makes your mouth water at the smell of food before you have taken a single bite. It is Pavlov's foundational insight, updated for the modern human brain. Applied to finance, the principle is precise. Your brain currently holds 0 dopamine association with opening an investment app or executing a transfer. The act is neurologically neutral at best, mildly aversive at worst, because it registers as a subtraction from available resources. But once the cue and reward become neurologically intertwined, the brain anticipates the reward at the point of the cue itself, producing dopamine before the secondary reward even arrives. This is not a metaphor. It is not a reframe. It is the actual mechanism by which habits encode themselves into the brain's architecture. Reward systems that deliver positive feedback at consistent intervals reinforce behavior durably, increasing the likelihood of repetition without conscious effort. And the practical application of this principle takes less than 60 seconds a day to implement. The strategy is called habit stacking. James Clear formalized the concept in Atomic Habits, using the formula of a preceding event as a cue. When I do this thing I already do, I will immediately do this new behavior. The power is in the sequence and the consistency, not the size of the financial action. Here's what that looks like in practice. You make your morning coffee. That ritual already carries a dopamine association. The warmth, the aroma, the comfort of a predictable routine. Now you link it. As the coffee brews, you open your investment account and transfer a fixed, pre-decided amount. It does not matter if the amount is $20 or 200. What matters is the pairing, repeated every time, without exception. What happens neurologically over 6 to 8 weeks is measurable. As the loop repeats, the cue and the reward become intertwined until a powerful sense of anticipation causes the same spike in brain activity as the reward itself, but before the reward arrives. At that stage, a habit is born. Then you add a second layer, a brief, explicit celebration immediately after the transfer, a fist pump, a verbal acknowledgement, something physically performative, because the brain encodes rewards that you make visceral and immediate more durably than passive ones. The result, with enough repetition, is that opening the investment app starts to feel genuinely good on its own, not because of the money, because of the loop. You now have the strategy. But strategy alone is not the finish line. The real transformation happens at the level of systems and identity. And the gap between someone who does this occasionally and someone who does it automatically for the rest of their life is smaller than you think. The single biggest mistake people make when changing financial behavior is relying on motivation. Motivation is a feeling. Feelings are temporary. The moment life gets complicated, the feeling disappears and the behavior goes with it. Systems do not depend on feelings. They run whether you are motivated or not. The goal now is to remove every point of friction from your saving behavior. E-commerce platforms and digital interfaces optimize for convenience, making unplanned action easy through one-click responses and removal of barriers between intention and purchase. You need to apply that exact logic in reverse in your own financial environment. Research on automatic pension enrollment found that when employees were enrolled by default rather than by choice, participation rates climbed from around 49% to over 86%. The behavior did not become more attractive. It became frictionless. That is the entire explanation. Apply this directly. Automate the investment transfer on payday so the decision never has to be made consciously. Move your investment app to your phone's home screen and bury your most used shopping app behind extra steps. Open a separate high-yield account that requires deliberate action to withdraw from. Structure your financial environment so that the desired behavior is always the path of least resistance. Decision fatigue is real. The only reward that consistently matters is the delayed one, and yet the delayed reward only arrives if the behavior consistently happens first. Make the initial response absurdly easy. When a behavior costs no cognitive energy, it simply happens. James Clear identified something that most behavioral frameworks overlook. The most durable form of habit change is not behavioral. It is identity-based. The goal is not to read a book, but to become a reader. Not to run a marathon, but to become a runner. The person who says, "I am trying to save more money," is using willpower. They are fighting against their default identity to execute a behavior that feels foreign. The person who says, "I am an investor," is doing something categorically different. Every time they save, they are simply acting in accordance with who they already are. The habit requires no resistance because it is not a departure from the self. It is an expression of it. Identity shifts do not happen through affirmations. They happen through accumulated evidence. Every time you execute the behavior, you cast a vote for the new identity, training the brain to crave rewards associated with that behavior. This is how habit formation occurs, often without conscious effort. You are not transferring $20. You are providing your brain with another data point confirming that you are the kind of person who builds wealth. Enough data points, and the brain updates its model of who you are. The financial behavior stops feeling like a chore you impose on yourself, and starts feeling like something that would be strange to skip. The identity is no longer something you are working toward. It is something you are already living inside. The identity is shifting. The system is running. And now comes the part most financial education never reaches, what it actually feels like when the compound effect stops being a concept and starts showing up in your life. There is a concept in mathematics called the inflection point. In a compounding curve, growth is nearly invisible for an extended period. Then, without warning, it becomes undeniable. The line bends sharply upward and delivers in a compressed window what took years to accumulate. Most people quit during the flat part of the curve, 1 month before the bend. The same dynamic applies to the brain. For the first several weeks of habit stacking, the system feels deliberate. You are aware of the pairing. You are noticing the celebration. The dopamine response is mild. But around the 6 to 8 week mark, something measurable changes. The behavior starts to precede the conscious intention. You find yourself opening the investment app before you have decided to. The identity is integrating. The habit has been encoded. At that point, compounding begins in two places simultaneously: in your account balance, growing quietly in the background, and in your neural architecture, where the habit is becoming increasingly automatic, durable, and genuinely pleasurable. This is the destination that mainstream financial advice never reaches. Not the spreadsheet, not the budget, not the motivational poster. The real prize is the day when discipline stops being something you practice and becomes something you simply are. When the act of investing feels like a reward in itself. When missing a contribution creates a mild but real discomfort because it conflicts with your identity. That is not a fantasy. That is neuroscience. And it is available to anyone willing to build the loop, trust the flat part of the curve, and stay in the game long enough to reach the bend.